Professor Hashim Jalal. So Professor Hashim Jalal Center for Southeast Asia Studies now embarking into a series of discussion about every single ASEAN member states. As we know that we have been all together for decades with ASEAN, but not many of us understand each other. So that's why we initiate this program to understand every single ASEAN member states, as we have done with Malaysia, and this time around is with Singapore. So now here with me is the expert top leader, I would say the top leader of Singapore on strategic issues is Pak Bilahari Kausikan. Let me, Pak, just briefly mention your resume. You are very well known in Singapore, and also will try to introduce you in the region. You are an ambassador of Singapore to Russia from 94 to 95, and then the permanent representative to the UN, to the United Nations in New York in 95 to 98, and then permanent secretary to Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore from 2010 to 2013. So, Pak Bilahari, what is interesting about you? One of our senior fellow at FVCI is Ambassador Sumadi Brotodiningrat.
Oh, good friend.
And he very, very vividly remember you during the time in New York. Even before I jump into the room, Pak Sumadi was currently next in the door, and Pak Sumadi tell regards to Pak Bilahari. Many stories Pak Sumadi told me about you.
Give him my regards.
So, Pak,
too.
welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on this initiative. I think it's a very good memorial to the late Hashim Jalal, who was a good friend too. I think you're absolutely right. I think the elites of the ASEAN member states know each other pretty well, I would say, but I don't think the same can be said about the populations of our country. We have stereotypes about each other rather than knowledge about each other.
That's true, man. That's true. Too many stereotypes to one another, right? So that's why we make this program. So, Pak Bilahari, let's straight to the conversation. The idea of this the idea of this discussion is simply talking about Singapore, not Singapore. Talking about the general sense of Singapore. Let's focus on the strategic culture of Singapore. As you know, strategic culture is a culmination of political culture, history, norms, and values that now strategic issues. Can you tell us and elaborate how Singapore, that was born during that very comfortable time, difficult time, regionally and globally, navigate through the time and become a successful country in the world? Please, Pak Bila.
Okay, I think that's a very good question. It would take me probably a week to answer it in full, but let me try to give you a very short version. I think one of the things that most ordinary Indonesians, by ordinary Indonesians, I mean people who don't take a particular interest in international relations or regional relations, do not fully understand about Singapore is that we are a very small place. Right? We are a city-state. In fact, the UN recognizes only 3 city-states: Singapore, Monaco, and the Vatican. But really, there's only one city-state, that's us, because Monaco is something less than a state, right? And Vatican is something more than a state. Right? Now, when you are very small, you have to start from a premise that is quite alien to Indonesians. That is, you are irrelevant. You perform no function that is of intrinsic relevance in the international system. Therefore, the fundamental strategic imperative of a small city-state is how do you create relevance for yourself? Right? Now, there is no definitive answer to creating relevance, because what makes you relevant vis-a-vis one country this week may be irrelevant vis-a-vis another country next month. And even if you're dealing with the same country, it's a relational and dynamic concept. It's a constant search for relevance. Now, there's no magic formula, obviously, to make yourself relevant, but there are some broad principles. Now, if you're a small country, you don't have a very wide range of options in any situation. On the other hand, if you are a wealthy small country, you certainly have much more options than a weak small than a poor small country. That's a very crass thing to say, but I think it's a reality of life. Now, one of the options that you must have if you're a small country is to have the capability to defend yourself. Uh, Without that capability to defend yourself, you will not be able to create wealth, or even if you create wealth, you may not be able to hold on to it. But that said, to 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 be relevant, you cannot be just an ordinary country. Because if you're just ordinary and you're small, why on earth would anybody want to deal with you? So you have to try to make yourself extraordinary. But making yourself extraordinary sometimes does not make you loved by your neighbors. And so there's a certain paradox. You have to live with your neighbors because you can't move this island somewhere else, but you cannot be exactly like them, right? Because if you're exactly like them, why should anybody want to deal with you rather than larger neighbors and who have got a lot of natural resources and so on, right? Now, to manage this paradox is the essence of the Singapore foreign policy, right? Now, for a small country to navigate the world, to navigate between great power competition, which is a reality which is never absent, you have to have a very strong sense of your national interest, right? And Singapore's fundamental national interest is embedded in the circumstances of Singapore's independence. Now, we emerge out of those very complicated and entangled processes after the Second World War that entangled decolonization with the Cold War, which, don't forget, the Cold War was hot in Southeast Asia. And, right? And it brought us into Malaysia, and it also brought us out of Malaysia. Why could we not stay in Malaysia? Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the first generation political leaders, our political leaders, did not believe that a small city-state could be viable in the 20th century. So they did not seek independence by itself, by ourselves. We sought independence as part of a larger entity, Malaysia. But it did not work out. It did not work out because, I think, of a fundamental difference of political philosophy. What kind of Malaysia is it going to be? Mr. Lee and the first generation stood for what they called then a Malaysian Malaysia, where there would be Bangsa Malaysia, and all the various Bangsa that make up Bangsa Malaysia would be on an equal footing, right? But the Malay political leadership stood for Malaysia based on the idea of Ketuanan Melayu, right? Now, these two, whereas we stood for a kind of multiracial idea, multiracial equality. Now, these two ideas proved incompatible. And to prevent racial riots, to prevent violence, we had to leave. Now, that fundamental principle, a Singapore that organizes itself on the basis of multiracial meritocracy rather than ethnic hierarchy of one kind or the other, is Singapore's core national interest, to defend that idea of Singapore. It is the essential value on which modern Singapore is based. And it, in some ways, complicates the paradox I told you, that we have to live with our neighbors. This is our neighborhood, but we cannot be exactly like our neighbors because who else will deal with us? That said, how do we defend that core value? We defend that core value by a foreign policy that is pragmatic. Small countries, as I said earlier, do not have as many options as big countries in any situation. But you are never helpless. There is always something you can do. There is always agency. Whether you have the brain to recognize what you can do with your agency and whether you have the ability and courage to do those things, that's another matter, right? But in principle, there is always something you can do. Otherwise, we will not be here talking to each other because Singapore, as you know it today, should not exist, right? Now, this requires a very cold-blooded, pragmatic, clinical view of the world so that you can understand without sentiment, without illusion, where you stand, where you can go, what are the limits of where within which you can exercise your agency. Right? It's not rocket science. It's rather easy to explain it. Although I told you I can go on for 1 week, but in practice, of course, it is subject to all the myriad uncertainties of the world. But that, in essence, is Singapore's approach to the world. We have agency. We will exercise agency. We search for relevance using our agency. But our relevance, we do not wish to quarrel with our neighbors, but we cannot be exactly like them because otherwise nobody will deal with us. And our core value that we seek to defend is how we organize ourselves, which is quite unique in Southeast Asia. Most Southeast Asian countries are organized on the basis of ethnic and or religious hierarchy, right? Now, I'm not saying that multiracialism in Singapore is perfect. Of course, it's not perfect. There's no perfection to be found on earth. Perfection can be found perhaps only in heaven, if you believe in heaven. But we take this idea seriously and we continually try to improve how we put it into practice. That is our core interest. And that requires, when we navigate a very uncertain world, a world, by the way, is not merely uncertain, in which identity politics of various kinds is becoming more and more prominent in all countries, in all regions, including in Southeast Asia, requires a very pragmatic, clinical, cold-blooded way of looking at the world without illusion. I'll stop here. Hello.
I think the host has been disconnected.
Hello,
Okay.
Pabila. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So sorry. Thank you so much. Okay, so do you want to continue or
No,
you want to stop? I
I'll
have
stop
some
there.
questions.
Otherwise, we'll take all week. So you better ask me your questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Pabila, I'm always been very interested with Singapore. When you celebrate the Singapore 60, I watched in the CNA where you were there featured in a history about the document that has been just released to the public about the separation between Singapore and Malaysia, and I watch very closely about that every episode of that documentary. I want to divide this question into two questions, right? I want to travel back when the early founding of Singapore, and I want to ask you about how you describe the key challenges that of Singapore in the early founding that leads to crystallizing the agency of Singapore during after the separation, because separation was a shock at the time. And I remember in the documentary that explained also That's also in the same time where Malaysia and Indonesia has conflict, and Singapore also was a home for British air base in the region. That's
And
become a
naval base.
strategic asset where also pivoting to the British also to navigate the situation, and the region was very hot at the time. So my question is, number one, my first questions. Let's travel back. Can you crystallize what was key challenges of Singapore at the time that create or crystallize the agency of Singapore that relevance until today? And after this, I want to ask also how that relates into the founding of ASEAN later on. Please, Pabila.
Okay, first of all, let me say that CNA documentary wasn't very good. Huh? They didn't
Oh,
do very good.
really?
They
Oh
didn't
my
do
God.
good. They didn't do very good research, and all the documents they use have been released long ago. They just discovered it as if it was something new. Okay, it's not. It's been on the public
Okay.
record for about 20 years. Okay, okay.
All right.
But
All
so
right.
it's
All
not
right. I
very
need to
good, but
watch
it's
another
okay.
one.
Good enough if you know zero is good enough, right? So
Okay.
okay, I mean, the first thing we had to do, we are quite a unique country that we did not seek independence. We had independence thrust upon us. Not
Right.
uh, so the first thing we had to do is to survive. Just think of the situation we found ourselves in August 1965. All right, Malaysia gave us more or less an ultimatum: you have to leave, or else there would be a very high probability, in fact, I think certainty, of racial violence. Right? So we left. Um, the relationship between Singapore and Malaysia, as you can understand, wasn't the best, of course, right? And there were Malaysians calling for the forceful reunification of Singapore and Malaysia. And we had no military force. We had no military force. The entire Singapore Armed Forces consisted of two light infantry battalions with no heavy weapons. And to our horror, we found that more than half of the soldiers were Malaysians, and they went back, right? And I don't know whether you know, many Singaporeans themselves don't know that by the separation agreement, which is still a valid agreement, Malaysia is allowed to station armed forces in Singapore. To this day, if they want to. They've decided that it is not wise to do so, and they did. They did for a few years until we built up our armed force hurriedly with the help of Israel. And why Israel? Because we asked almost every other country in the world, and they all turned us down. They turned us down because they didn't think we could survive. The British turned us down, the Australians turned us down, the New Zealanders turned us down, the Indians turned us down, even the Egyptians turned us down. Right? So that was the first imperative. Right? As I said, the Malaysians did station armed forces in Singapore, as they are entitled to do, until 1967 or 68, when we revealed for the first time that we had armor, tanks, and we knew how to operate them. And then they realized that they had better withdraw their forces, and they did. Right? That was the first challenge, physical survival. And don't forget, you mentioned it yourself, confrontasi was ongoing, right? When in 1965, it was towards the end, but it was still ongoing, right? And it was confrontasi against Malaysia, and after we were separated, against Malaysia and Singapore, right? So that was the first challenge, sheer physical survival. Second is economic survival. Singapore was founded as an entrepot whose hinterland was Malaya, West Malaysia, and to some degree Indonesia, especially the Riau's. Right. Now, first of all, of course, Malaysia was trying to cut us off. Secondly, of course, because confrontasi was ongoing, it was difficult to restart traditional patterns of trade and so on. In fact, it was almost impossible. And unemployment in Singapore was running at, I can't remember the exact, but in the low teens, 14, 15%, something like that, unemployment. Right? The major employer in Singapore were the British military bases, naval base basically, and also air base. But the British also served us notice shortly after that they are going to withdraw. So the second thing was, how do we make a living? People have to eat, right? So we did something that was counterintuitive. The development theory of those days was that multinationals are the enemy, because multinationals are more powerful than most countries in the third world, which they were actually, at least financially. So you should keep them out, right? But if Singapore's population was then only 2 million or so, how can you have a domestic-based growth strategy if you have only a domestic market of 2 million people? It's ridiculous. No. So we did something that's counterintuitive. We told ourselves, we are a sovereign state now. As a sovereign state, we have agency. So if we use our agency, we don't allow our own agency to be corrupted by external forces, we can hold our own against the multinationals. So we create conditions and we invited them in to create employment, to bring skills and so on, and it did work, right? The third vulnerability we had was water. Water is life, as you all know, right? Most of our water came from Malaysia, and there were people in Malaysia talking quite wildly. They still do from time to time, but not very often these days, that they will cut water to bring us under control. Well, that's what the SAF is for. The Malaysians understand that, and we have in the same time over the 60 years developed our own indigenous sources of water. We'll still take some water from Malaysia, but we have new water which is reverse osmosis. We have desalination, and we have, you may not know, there are maybe 20 odd reservoirs in Singapore. I can't remember the exact number. It's not just Changi, Pierce, and Seletar Reservoir. There are 20 odd in total, mainly underground. And we collect almost every drop of rainwater that falls on Singapore. I think we have one of the highest collection rates of rainwater in the world, right? So now SAF is strong, we have deterrence, and that deterrence is the foundation of the good relationships we enjoy with all our neighbors. Secondly, we are interdependent with our neighbors. We are no longer dependent on them. We are a big investor in both Malaysia, Indonesia, and in fact in all the ASEAN countries. And we have our own water. But what that period has instilled into us is not to take anything for granted. You all have heard of the kiasu Singaporean, right? Well, kiasuism has its roots in an acute sense of vulnerability. And that sense of vulnerability is what keeps us going. That what keeps us working to make ourselves relevant as the world changes, keeps us going to keep ourselves unique in an age of identity politics, where various identities around the world, not just in Southeast Asia, in the West too, are being asserted as more authentic or superior to other identities, right? So this sense of this initial period is very important to us. It's probably as important to us as the period of revolution is in Indonesian political history, 1945 and so on, right?
Yeah, that you mentioned a very strong concept,
Yeah.
from dependent to interdependent. I think that's a very strong concept to dive in. Now, you also mentioned interesting about the relevance and agency. Now, how that translate to ASEAN? And how that translate to ASEAN, and how Singapore back then thinking about the region, because regionalism in Southeast Asia was failed numerous
several times.
We make
Yeah.
several times.
Yeah.
And then we stop with ASEAN. Can you tell us the thinking behind why you push Singapore for ASEAN back then, and what's the
Well,
strategic thinking behind?
I must admit, Singapore in the early years was extremely skeptical about ASEAN. Um, the the idea of regional solutions to regional problems is one that was that is greeted with great skepticism. And if you're a small country, you can understand why. Because regional solutions to regional problems can easily become the big countries imposing their solutions on the smaller countries of a region. That is certainly China's idea, regional solutions. Asians to solve Asian problems. By Asia, they mean China, right? But I think ASEAN, what is interesting, yes, there were many, many failed experiments at regionalism before ASEAN. All of them were actually trying to deal with two fundamental problems. And ASEAN was the final solution to do with two fundamental problems, which is what to do with the biggest country in Southeast Asia and what to do with the smallest country in Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Singapore. Why Indonesia?
Yeah.
Well, Indonesia is a very nationalistic country. And under your first question, your nationalism took a rather assertive form, say confrontasi, right? And Singapore was considered, first of all, Singapore is majority Chinese in a region where Chinese are not always a welcome minority, but it also was considered extremely left-wing. So the British were not really very left-wing. It could have become, and all the original ASEAN members, we had differences among ourselves, but we were all non-communist or anti-communist, and Indonesia included after October 1965, the abortive coup. So Singapore was also regarded with a certain wariness. So how you deal with the biggest country, how do you deal with the smallest countries? Different reasons, right? And the answer to that was a regional organization, right? So that we are all bound by certain rules. We don't have to give up our identities. We don't have to give up our national interests. But when we define our national interests, we have to include in that some part of the regional interest. It's not going to be the same on every issue, but it should not be absent completely on any issue. And ASEAN, therefore, is a very flexible organization, as you know, but Westerners sometimes find it hard to understand. We don't try to have a common position on every issue. It's impossible. We are now 11 countries, 11 member states, and it's such a diverse group of countries. Obviously, you're going to have different interests, different strategic outlooks, different ways of assessing different situations. So you can't possibly have a common position on every issue. So we don't try, but we try to have a common position on the basic issues that are of key importance to the region. And the most basic issue, I think all of us, despite all our differences, what we can agree is we want our own autonomy. We want to exercise our own agency to determine our own destiny, not let some bigger country determine it for us, not to let China or US or India or Japan or the EU determine it for us. The most important thing about ASEAN, which is not often written about, is ASEAN is an attempt by the countries of a region to define the region for themselves. You know that Southeast Asia is actually a relatively recent concept. It's a geopolitical concept that was defined in different ways, but usually by external powers. But ASEAN is an attempt to say, well, this is our region. We will define it according to our interests, our common interests. We may not always agree, but we at least agree on this, that we want to determine our own destiny by ourselves. ASEAN is a bit of a contradiction in terms. I think Europeans in particular find it difficult to understand. We are not a supranational organization like the EU, and we do not pretend to be one. we are regionalism based on nationalism. It seems to be a contradiction in terms, but it works. As you can see, it's going to be 60 years old in a year or so, in 2 years. Right? So we were quite skeptical, but we thought it's worth a try because we have to live with our neighbors. And this is another mechanism. It's not going to be I don't think it's going to be the main mechanism for any ASEAN member because that's always going to be national. Right? We are not a supranational organization, but it's always going to be one of the tools in our toolkit. One of the important tools in our toolkit for all of us, Singapore included. That's how we use our agency. Now, when I say a tool in our toolkit, I don't think it would be wrong to think that Singapore or any ASEAN member thinks that this is a solution to all our problems. It's not. The solutions are basically national, right? But this is an additional tool. Indonesia used to have a very good slogan that was quite current in the 1980s, but it's disappeared somehow now. I don't know why, but I think we should try to resurrect it. National resilience leads to regional resilience, and regional resilience enhances national resilience. That encapsulates the essence of ASEAN, I think. So we should try to revive this slogan for a new generation.
Don't worry, but that slogan is within Lemhanas, but that's a thing.
Yeah,
like
but it's only within
not that,
Lemhanas. It's forgotten by the rest of ASEAN. It's only old people like me who can remember it.
That's true. That's true.
I know it's a Lemhana slogan, but it also actually is a very good description of how ASEAN is conceptualized and how it works.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Now, I would like to invite two discussants. We have two of my good friend, Mbak Reina from Lab 45, and also Mbak Aisyah from EC, Indo-Pacific Strategic Intelligence. And I would like to Reina to ask the first questions first, and then Aisyah, you can ask the second questions, and then Pak Bila can directly answer both questions. And then after that, I would like to open to everyone. If you have any questions, just post it or you can raise your hand. Maybe you can start with Reina and then Aira, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Calvin. Hello, Pak Bila. It was really interesting to hear such a good explanation, like throwing back such a historical step by step about looking back how Singapore is and how the foreign policy shaped now. And I think I want to ask you a bit about the current situation, as you have already mentioned the previous situation about how Singapore is in the position within ASEAN. And I want to know, how does Singapore assess ASEAN's capacity now, like the current capacity to respond collectively to emerging security challenges, including first, if you remember the U.S. Secretary of War's address in late September, there is now growing talk of a more restrained U.S. posture in the Indo-Pacific that is emphasizing peace through strength and greater burden sharing among allies. And well, that is one great power rivalry. And we also still have maritime tensions, we cannot deny. And now we have more hybrid threats emerging, yes, like, for example, cyber and so on. And I would like to know, can ASEAN defense cooperation realistically evolve to strengthen regional deterrence and crisis management without maybe undermining national sovereignty, as maybe it's a bit heavy questions from your previous explanation, but I would like to know if the current situation within ASEAN, how Singapore sees the challenges, especially the security challenges, the current one. Maybe if you can answer that for us, like explain to us in a really not even though the question is quite heavy, but I really like how you explain the terms quite simple, and it's really easy to understand if let's say some of us are not coming from international relations background. That's really helpful, I guess. Thank you, Fabila.
Yeah, I think you can answer it directly, Pabila, and then after that, Aira, you can ask the second question. Pabila, you can answer it first.
That's a very good question. Again, it's one of those questions that can take a week to answer, but I won't take a week, okay? I'll just take a few minutes. So forgive me if I oversimplify a bit, right? Now, first of all, I happen to believe that competition among powers and therefore conflict, at least the risk of conflict, these are inherent characteristics of international relations. They are never absent, right? They are never absent. Sometimes the competition and the risks are high intensity, sometimes they are lower intensity, but they are never absent. From that kind of perspective, actually the kinds of uncertainties and risks that we face today are not new. They are not new at all. They are what the late Donald Rumsfeld, former Secretary of Defense, called known unknowns. And we have navigated them before, all of us, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, all that. We have navigated worse risks, actually, because don't forget, the Cold War was hot in Southeast Asia. Right? With far less capabilities. All of us had far less capabilities in the 60s, in the 70s, even in the 80s than we have now. Right? So I think we should look at the risks in perspective. Right? Secondly, Singapore has never made any secret of our belief that to manage this risk, you need a balance of power. And the US, whether you like it or you dislike it, is going to be a vital element of any balance of power, particularly in East Asia. Because if there is no US, there is no way you can balance the biggest power in East Asia, which is China. And if you cannot balance China, if there's no balance, then you will have, all of us will be dealing with China in such a state of asymmetry that our autonomy is probably going to be lost. Right? So we start from that premise. And this is a very consistent Singapore position. We have said it from the beginning. I do not know whether you know that Singapore in 1967 nearly walked out of the meeting that was drafting the Bangkok Declaration over this issue, over the issue about military bases in Southeast Asia. Right? Because we first of all, at that time, we had hardly any armed force of our own. And secondly, the Cold War was hot. And you cannot, and we said, this is a vital issue. We are not going, if this is going to be the issue, this is a breaking point for us. And we almost walked out of the meeting, but a compromise was found to say that the bases are temporary and there by the sovereign decision of the countries that host them. Right? Well, we're temporary for 60 years. Whereas, never mind. But I think now this view that stability, peace, prosperity must be based on a balance of power, and the US is a vital element of that balance of power, used to be thought to be a very eccentric Singaporean view. The Singaporeans, there they go again, right? You remember what happened in the late 1988? You can't remember, you are too young. You were not born in the late, right? But okay, you have read about what happened in the late 1980s when a combination of the failed negotiations and then there was a volcanic eruption caused the US to leave Subic Bay and Clark Airfield in the Philippines. So we thought that it is important to have some physical US military presence in the region to maintain this balance. Now, it's not going to be a substitute for Subic or Clark because, you can take Singapore and you drop the whole island into Subic Bay, we will never be found again. But from a political, diplomatic, strategic point of view, it's important to have a physical presence. So we signed a memorandum of understanding with the US to put this into effect in 1990. What happened? All hell broke loose. Indonesia and Malaysia reacted, in my view, overreacted hysterically, putting immense pressure on us to try to rescind that agreement. Of course, we did, right? Right? Now, fast forward, that's 1990, yeah? Fast forward to 2019, when we renewed that agreement. What happened? The simple answer is nothing happened. Not a whimper or protest from anybody. And in between, in 2005, we signed what we call a strategic framework agreement with the US that brought the level of our defense and security cooperation far above formal US allies like Thailand and the Philippines. It's below Japan and South Korea, of course, because we are not an ally. We don't expect the US to defend us. We just expect the US to maintain the overall balance of power, and we will do what we can to help do that and sell us some weapons that we cannot make ourselves. What happened? Nothing happened. Why? I wish I could tell you that this is a great triumph for Singapore diplomacy and so on, and we are such genius diplomats and so on. It is not true. It is not a success of Singapore diplomacy. It is a failure of Chinese diplomacy. In the meantime, I think there is a realization throughout Southeast Asia, in fact, throughout East Asia, that this idea that stability, peace must be based on a balance of power, and the US is a vital element of that balance of power, has become mainstream. It's not an eccentric Singaporean idea anymore. Now, we can probably do more with the US than other countries can, because other countries' domestic politics is different, right? But countries are doing what they can. You look, Vietnam, who fought a long and bitter war with the US, is enhancing defense relations. Even Indonesia, that has got a long and proud, non-aligned foreign policy, free and active foreign policy, you are doing what you can. You participate in military exercises with the US. You have your own Super Garuda shield, which is getting bigger and bigger with US allies. For 2 years at least, you have been participating in Talisman Sabre with Australia and the US. And Talisman Sabre is now regularly, other NATO countries regularly participate in Talisman Sabre. So in Malaysia, which is another country with a strong non-aligned agreement, the next ADMM Plus is going to sign some kind of defense cooperation agreement with the US. So what we do with the US is kind of regarded, I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, I don't want to exaggerate it, but kind of regarded as a regional public group to maintain a balance so that other ASEAN countries can maintain our autonomy. Now, this is all actually the fundamental purpose of ASEAN does not play a big role in all of this, I must admit. ASEAN has been rather slow to adapt to a rapidly changing strategic environment. But that is not exactly new, because ASEAN, the fundamental purpose of ASEAN is to manage relations among its members. Right? As far as external relationships is concerned, the primary means has always been national. ASEAN is a secondary means. That's always been the case. It will always be the case. But even then, I think we have been rather slow to adapt to rapidly changing situation. So we keep saying that we are central, we are central, we are central. You know, it's like a mantra we repeat over and over again. But I don't think we are as central as we used to be, frankly. I mean, all our partners are very polite, you know, to us, but we should not mistake politeness for, you know, strategic calculations. Why are we slow? We are slow, I think, for two reasons. We were able to move fast and decisively when we had only 5 members. So obviously, it's easier to get consensus among 5 than 10 or 11 or how many, right? But that's a simple arithmetical equation, shall we say. But I think there's a more profound reason. All our domestic politics is getting more and more complicated. All of us. Even countries that are still communist in form, like Vietnam and Laos, their domestic politics is much more complicated now. Now, it's a dirty little secret that when ASEAN was able to move quickly, nimbly, and decisively, including forming ASEAN, none of us, the original 5, were democracies in any sense of the word. Right? Now, I'm not saying we should go back to that. It's not possible and it's not desirable anyway, right? But the fact is, all our domestic politics is getting more and more complicated. And therefore, it takes longer to get internal consensus on anything. And if you can't get internal consensus, it's going to take longer to get regional consensus. But the world is moving at a very faster pace. You name some of the new challenges, cyber, gray zone tactics, and so on. These are going to be harder and harder for us to deal with on a regional level. We'll have to be primarily national and then bilateral or plurilateral cooperation among various ASEAN countries. Look, let's be very frank. Cyber threats. How many countries have, in ASEAN members, have the capability to deal with cyber threats? Timor-Leste, don't make me laugh. Laos also, I'm not so sure. Cambodia, I'm not so sure. Myanmar, don't even talk about it. So it's only a handful of countries, and even within those handful, the capabilities vary a lot. Right? South China Sea, maritime issues, they are going to be there. There's going to be there. There are some issues that can never be resolved. They can only be managed. And one of the tools of management is to have a stable balance of power. And that stable balance of power brings me back, circling around, to the vital role the US presence plays in this region. Now, the US has changed, of course. What is the change? We, I think, pay too much attention to Mr. Trump's unique personality, shall I put it politely. But I don't think we pay enough attention to what Mr. Trump represents in broader historical context. Now, why was the US... Now, okay, let me step one back, right? After the end of the Cold War, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US does not face any existential threat anywhere in the world. China is a formidable peer competitor, but is it an existential threat? I don't think so. Russia is an existential threat to Ukraine, maybe, and maybe some of the Baltic states. But to the US, I don't think so. North Korea, Iran, and so on, maybe they are regional threats, but not to the US. And if you don't face an existential threat, why should America, to quote JFK, John F. Kennedy, at the height of the Cold War, bear any burden, pay any price, fight any foe to uphold its idea of world order? Now, this is not America retreating from the world, but it's America going to define its national interest in a more narrow and a more transactional way, right? I'm still going to be here in my own interest, but I'm going to define my interest differently. Why was America relatively generous in opening its markets for many years? It's not because they really believe in free trade, because free trade has always been very contentious in American diplomatic history from the beginning of the Republic, right? They opened their markets as a tool in the Cold War competition against the Soviet Union to bind their allies and their friends to them. It was not out of altruism. So no Soviet Union, why should I be so altruistic? Time to put America first. That's Trump's slogan, but actually it's not unique. Every country puts itself first. Tell me, name me one country who does not put itself first, right? So I think we just have to get used to it. I don't think America will retreat from our region because this is still, despite all our problems, our region, meaning the broader region, the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, is still the fastest growing region in the world. And Mr. Trump does not like to be seen to be a loser. Why should he give up the fastest growing region of the world, right? He's not stupid. He's not intellectual, but he's not stupid. So they'll be here in their own interests. Their interests are going to be defined more transactionally, and they will expect us to do more to support them. Or you want to put it very crudely, you want my help, you pay for it. All right? But they'll be around.
Thank you. Ira, please, and then you can directly answer. And then after that, we closed it up because I think you need to leave in a few minutes.
Oh, I still got some time, but
Ira,
you want to, okay. You can get a few questions from the audience if you like, but not too many.
Okay. All right. Ira, please.
All right, thank you so much, Calvin. And thank you, Mr. Bilahari, for the interesting presentation. I think there are several points that I caught from your presentation that is actually like caught my interest. The first one is like how Singapore strategic culture is actually like it's rooted in vulnerability consciousness. So I think like there's a belief that the survival depends on constant vigilance, self-reliance, adaptability, and this is actually stems from founding condition. Singapore, small size and lack of natural resources and turbulent neighborhood. And one of the things that I would like to ask you is about the total defense concept of the Singapore. So how it integrates military, civilian, economic, social, digital, psychological dimensions, and all embedding security consciousness into the national identity. And somehow it reflects a belief that defense is not just of the SAF task, but the society's as collective responsibility. So what I want to ask you is, in terms of Singapore civil military relations, they are often described as a model of stability and professionalism in Southeast Asia. I mean, like Indonesia is trying to do that like for a long time to actually like separate like military professional function and the political function. But it seems that Indonesia has a long way to go since like it began to actually regress back to the new order. And I would like to ask whether in this era of information where warfare and there's social polarization, so how might this compact be tested? And can Singapore's total defense framework continue to sustain high level of societal trust? And how civil military coherence under the strain of hybrid threats and domestic confrontation has the relevance within it?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. Again, it's one of those questions. It will not take a week. It may take a month to answer, but I will try to do it as short as possible. Okay, the origin of the SAF is as a citizen army. We knew we cannot afford, with our small population and our dire economic situation, maintain a large standing army. I don't know whether you know, we all do military service. The full-time military service, it varies. When I was doing it, if you're an officer, 3 years, and now it's about 2 years and 2 and a bit. But our operational force is not the full-time force. Our operational force is the reserve. We all go and do the reserve depending on your rank. For example, I did reserve until I was 50 years old, a few weeks every year. Because our operational force is the reserve force. It's not the standing force. The standing force is almost, I'm talking about ground force. Air Force and Navy is a bit different, obviously, because it is much more technical. Right? But our standing force, when you're doing your full-time military service, it is almost 100% training. And then you go into reserve, and that's the operational force. Right? So the integration of civil and military are there from the beginning, right? You know, I once joked. Sometimes when one of the times I was doing my full-time national service, we have a rapid reaction force among the reserve, right? That means you go around for your 2 or 3 weeks with live ammunition. You're carrying a lot of things with you all over the place. And I was joking I was joking to my higher echelon commander, you know, I can pull a coup because I know I'm from a civil service. I was a senior civil servant. I know where the cabinet is meeting every time, right? But, you know, then he said, why are you talking like that? I said, I'm joking lah, because if I tell my soldiers that let's go and have a coup, they'll laugh at me. That's the advantage of having a citizen army. They will fight to defend the country. They're not going to fight for other reasons, right? Now, can we maintain this? And from that, the fact that it's a citizen army, the other pillars of total defense follow. Because you can't, it's not just the army that has to be strong. the society in which the army is embedded has to be strong too. And therefore you have psychological defense, etc., etc. You know all this. Now, what is the threat to this? I mentioned at the beginning, we live in an age of identity politics, whether we like it or not, right? All over the world, certain identities are being asserted as more authentic than others. And for us, that is the main threat. That's why we pay a lot of attention to maintaining social cohesion, right? China under Xi Jinping says that all Huaren, all Chinese must support his idea of the Chinese dream. Now that's to us a red line that we cannot cross. We will not allow them to cross. 75%, 74-75% of our population is Chinese. But they are Singapore Chinese. They are not China Chinese. Just like they are Indonesian Chinese, they are not China Chinese, right? So we cannot allow that, but China does assert that in various ways. There are certain 14% of our 15% of our population is Muslim, right? And certain ideas of Islam are being propagated as more authentic, right? Wahhabism, Salafism. Now, Indonesia is fighting back against it. You're trying to promote Islam Nusantara, which is a very important initiative of the former president. And it's much more important than many people in the West understand. Right? And there are certain types of evangelical Christianity are being promoted globally. These are all global issues, as more than and so on, right? Now, for us, this is essentially a domestic political problem. If we can manage this domestic political problem, and I think we can, so far so good, then we can manage the external dimensions. But if we lose control of the internal narrative, the internal political issue, then everything will become much more complicated, and we may fail. That's the short answer to a 1 month long answer.
Thank you so much, Pabila. I think you have explained it very well. So I would like to read one questions from the audience.
Sure.
We have received some questions.
If you got time, I can take two. I can take two. I just texted them just now saying I'll be a bit late, so it's okay.
Yes. I take two questions. One's from the audience, one's is from me to conclude the session.
Okay.
So let me read out. The question is coming from Muhammad Farhan Pratomo, right? From research. He is a research assistant at the Center for National Defense and Security Studies. He has two questions, but I picked the first questions because I think the first question is very relevant and yet to be really touched today. The questions is, we are seeing and witnessing the enlargement of ASEAN, where Timor-Leste just joined the ASEAN family. On the other hand, we are seeing an ongoing instability in the region, including the civil war in Myanmar and also the situation between Thailand and Cambodia. What is the Singaporean response to this double reality natures of ASEAN, right? And I would like to add another question, Spot. What is Singapore perception of threat today's, right? Singapore perception of threat, and how Singapore ideas about the next world order, right? Prime Minister Lawrence said in many interviews that the laws that we know is no longer applicable, but the new laws is yet to be written, right? So that's also the questions to wrap it up today's conversation. Please, Pabila.
Well, first of all, personally, I'm talking personally. Don't forget, I don't have any official position anymore. I am a bit worried about the decision to admit Timor-Leste. After 25 years, is it a viable country? I'm not sure. Right? You already got Myanmar falling apart. I don't think it will totally fall apart. I fear something like that might happen to Timor-Leste after the present generation of leaders leaves. And they will sooner or later as a matter of biological fact, right? Is it a viable country? I am not sure, frankly. I am not sure it was a good idea to admit them into ASEAN at this time, because I don't believe they have proven themselves to be a viable country yet. Thai, Cambodia, Myanmar, well, that is what ASEAN is minimally for, to help manage these things. We don't do it too well because as I mentioned in a answer to an earlier question, all our domestic politics is getting much more complicated. I suspect that the Thai-Cambodian problem has to do with the domestic politics of both countries, not just the border dispute over the temple, right? And well, but we'll have to do. We have gone through worse. We have gone through worse. Imagine, I don't know whether you know, Malaysia boycotted some early ASEAN meetings because of the Philippines' claim to Sabah. They refused to attend, but eventually they came back. Indonesia and Singapore went through a very bad phase in our relations in 1968 when we executed two Marines that killed people with bombs during confrontasi. Right? And you go through all the original ASEAN countries. We have all gone through terrible phases with each other, right? But we are still here. So I am not pessimistic about these things, provided Timor-Leste doesn't blow up in our faces before it stabilized, right? Perception of threat. Our fundamental perception of threat, frankly, external threats we can deal with. I think the SAF has good relations with all its counterparts around the region. And we have deterrence. We have maintained deterrence. We can maintain deterrence. Our real threat is internal, what I mentioned. In an age of identity politics, the way we've chosen to organize ourselves on the basis of a kind of horizontal organizing concept of multiracialism, whereas different ideas of different vertical concepts are being asserted on us, whether a Chinese concept or a Muslim concept or evangelical Christian concept or a secular Western concept also, because some people would like us to evolve our democracy in a Western direction, right? Now, those is the key threat to Singapore. It's an internal domestic political issue that we must manage. And I will repeat what I said just now. If we can manage this in an era when our domestic politics is becoming more complex, we can manage all the external threats. I'm very confident we can. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm confident we can manage. But if we lose control of this internal issue, then everything becomes more and more complicated. This is something else perhaps that a big country like Indonesia may find it hard to understand. A big country, because you're big, has a certain resilience. When former President Suharto fell, you went through about 10 years of internal turmoil, right? Internal instability, until the situation stabilized under Bambang Yudhoyono. Then it more or less stabilized, and now it is stable. The kind of instabilities you have is the normal political changes that every country will go through, right? Now, but that kind of 10 years, only a big country can survive, because you have an innate resilience being big. If Singapore, I cannot imagine Singapore going through that kind of 10 years of political instability, fundamental systemic instability, not normal political, changes and political flux that every country goes through. It is impossible for me to imagine that Singapore could have survived what Indonesia went through for 10 years after Pak Suharto fell. Right? Now you're okay. Okay, you had these riots recently and so on, right? And that's another matter. I don't want to comment about it. It's your internal matter, but I think it was not a systemic threat. It was not good, but it was not a systemic threat, right? But those 10 years, only a big country can survive. Small countries like Singapore could not have survived that period of political instability. systemic instability. So our main threat is internal. It's not external. External threats we can deal with. New world order, the final point. Well, I think it's always a mistake to think of any world order as the result of consensus. More often than not, the only order we know is defined by competition and the effort to make the competition less dangerous. Now, even that there was a short exceptional period, maybe 20 years from the time the Berlin Wall came down to when the global financial crisis broke out, where there seemed there's only one concept of world order, right? But that's an exceptional period. What we are experiencing now is a return to the norm. And even during the exceptional period, I don't think, I know Singapore did not, and I'm sure most ASEAN countries did not, agree with every aspect of that idea of world order. We were probably more, in Singapore, we are probably more committed to the economic rules and less to the political rules. We certainly rejected the assertion by some Western countries, which is part of that world order, that because some ideas are said to be universal, that gives you a right to say how we order our internal affairs. That we absolutely reject. Right? So our support for those rules was always qualified. And now we are in a transition period. What I think we are going to see is as follows. We all face two sets of realities. We have to deal with both China and the US, and these are not choices. We will deal with both, right? And we need to deal with both in order to deal with either effectively. If there's no US, we will deal with China in such a state of asymmetry, we will lose our autonomy. But if there's no China, this very transactional US is just going to disregard our interests completely. On the other hand, we do have concerns about both Chinese behavior and American behavior. That's the second set of reality. So what do? What we do is we are going to have to work more and more together. Not just within ASEAN, but different combinations of countries, like-minded countries, working together around different issues. Reforming in a different combination around other issues. It's a much more dynamic system. It's a much more fluid system. Some of these combinations will include China but not the US. Some will include the US but not China. Some may exclude both. And they're going to be cross-regional. You have, for example, it's not new, it's already been evolving. Mr. Trump 1.0 rejected TPP. But what do? We form CPTPP. We have RCEP. You have now UK joining CPTPP and the EU taking some interest in wanting to join CPTPP. You have India, who is member of the Quad, but is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization because he has interest in Central Asia. You have Japan, South Korea, and Australia taking an interest in NATO, and you have some NATO members taking an interest in security in this region. You're going to have this cross-border, cross-regional, fluid, dynamic system evolving, which is, I think, the future. And on that note, I will end, and I thank you for inviting me to share my views with you today.
Thank you so much, Pak Bila. You mentioned it right with many key points about the Singapore stories and also how it reflected to ASEAN, right? The conceptions of from dependent to interdependent, the conceptions of keeping yourself relevance, and how even in my view, how to make ASEAN gets more relevance, fit for purpose, and the keywords that you need to work together, get more closer together to navigate the world that Singapore has been proving herself that thriving to make herself always relevant to the region. That's why, Pak Bila Harin, also all viewers who are watching today, me myself, believing that the next world order should have a new elements the new elements of geocivic, the elements of geocivic. Geocivics mean is a term, Pak Bila, that I personally invented, meaning that a civic community that have a geographical limitation on Southeast Asia have an agency to not only actually it's a translation how to a security community amongst the citizens, believing that we are together, that we are trusting one another, and make ASEAN become a bottom up and addressing single problem from the bottom up. And this geocivic community, it should be strength, and that will strengthen the ASEAN civic space, which I think would color the new elements of the next world order. And that's why this is also part of that effort to inform and educate the wider public of Southeast Asia about every single ASEAN member states. And we have done Singapore today. We have took notes with many great interests and makes me want to learn more about Singapore. You know, Pak Bilahari, I read many books about Singapore. One of it, this one about Lee Kuan Yew, and many books in PSAT before having talked with you. And we are trying to pick up the next Southeast Asia country to study and to update you. Once we finish all 11, we will compile what we learn, the note, into a publications. And we hope it will strengthen understanding among ourselves. I think that's the important, just like at the beginning, the elites of ASEAN maybe have understand among of us, but down the line, if you talk to the people on the grassroots or even the academics, have we know much about Singapore, Malaysia? We know much about UK, maybe China,
US,
Japan,
China,
right, Australia. But are we know Singapore well, right, or Malaysia, right?
No, I think you have put your initiative is very important for that reason. ASEAN started as an elite organization, that is natural, but I don't think it can continue as just an elite organization.
Right.
It is a greater depth of support.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, Pak Bila. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for having your time. Thank you, Pak, for investing your time to speak with the young community here of PSAT. And please stay tuned in the next events of PSAT. Follow our social media handles, PSAT Asia Tenggara, in Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Pak Bilahari, thank you so much. And for everybody, my name is Calvin, Secretary of PSAT. See you on the next event. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pak
Bye
Bila.
bye.
Raina, thank you.
Pak.
Marina, thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
sir.
Mas Calvin.
Calvin.
Raina, thank
Thank you.
you.
Maira.
Thank you, both of you. Good questions.
Thank you, Pak.
Bye.
Bye.